with me.
The heavy cavalry charge. Who doesn't love that primal feeling of riding an armored horse, elbow to elbow with your mates in a do-or-die charge against the enemy? The pounding hoofs, the impending clash, it's almost combat sex.
Cut them down!
Well, Bannerlord has changed with the new 1.32 beta, and the changes are profound. Let's charge into this episode with the head of steam. Alright friends, welcome back again to another episode of Tactical Enlightenment. Our YouTube channel is dedicated to all things Bannerlord related. We are dedicated to the updates that come with the beta 1.32. And we are welcoming in changes to the combat system, even profound changes to the way that cavalry impact the game in Bannerlord. It's no secret that we've made a little bit of fun of heavy cavalry on the channel. Well, they finally have their revenge. We have asked, and Tailworlds has listened, and they have dramatically improved the way that cavalry perform in Bannerlord. Especially the charge is much more impactful to your army, especially units that don't have a shield or armor. You get knocked all over the place, the casualty rate is much higher, and even though they still are vulnerable to some of the problems before, units getting stood up and whatnot, you could tell from the death spam from this example here where we have a bunch of very good archers, that cavalry now are a devastating force in Bannerlord. Now in this episode we'll do extensive testing. We'll talk about different formations that I have tested. We'll talk about things not to do with heavy cavalry. I did discover some things you don't want to do with the new cavalry. We will talk about some of the unit changes because some of the kingdoms actually have different cavalry in their ranks. We will talk about some of the testing, some of the differences between the kingdoms. Some kingdoms do much better than others, and ultimately here with archers, we were better off suiciding than facing this batch of cavalry. It was quite ferocious, and I welcome these changes. Again, Tailworlds is dedicated to making Bannerlord better, just as we're dedicated to this channel, and so hopefully we can continue to give them the feedback they need to improve this great game. Let's jump into this episode. Alright, so the theme is pretty similar when you do testing with new cavalry in Bannerlord 1.32, and that is simply that they do a lot more damage on each successive pass through the infantry. So what I did in order to test this is do over and over again 300 against 300, and I did tier 4 and tier 5 archers in most examples, so there's no banner knights here. This is vanguard and knights and stuff like that. Good cavalry, but not overpoweringly. And as they come through, they do major damage. Now they cycle, and they tend to cycle in a nice big group, right? They got a 2-to-1 kill ratio that first time, and as they sweep through, each successive swing does major damage, right? Picking up the damage from the previous run, and eventually the archers were routed. So this was Valandia. They did quite well. They were near the best, but they weren't quite the best cavalry. Now I did 3 or 4 runs at most with each kingdom, but in the very early on for testing here, I came up with Khazate as the best kingdom for cavalry charges. Now there's all kinds of caveats to these results. The first things you should know, of course, is that this is still beta. There may be future changes. In fact, based on some of the future tests I'm going to show you here, there probably will be changes. Second, it depends on the terrain, it depends on what you're facing, it depends on 100 different factors. So don't take anything here set in stone, and we will await YouTubers like Strat Gaming Guide to run 10,000 examples of some of these to come up with something more definitive. This is just an early look, and in the early look, the Khazate did really, really well. Incidentally, I want to talk about formation. Almost all of these were just baseline runs. In fact, a few of these we just did sergeant, and that means line formation and charge. Nothing fancy here. We will talk about complex tactics, complex formations later on this episode. So first overall in the cavalry charge goes to Khazate, and they did very well with 250, give or take on average, horses left with each run. Again, you see them swinging back and forth, and eventually the enemy would rout. Second place goes to Valandia. I mentioned it before. Valandia does very well. They have a lot of cavalry that will spear brace, and in they come with their shields after initial devastating charge, just like the other ones they cycled back and forth. Speeding this along a little bit, the Aserai did well, coming up holding their shields, and don't forget, units in line formation will still hold their shields up, but then the javelins started to fly, and javelins are hella accurate in Bannerlord, and the Vanguard, or not the Vanguard Ferris, but the Veteran Ferris did major work in these examples. They weren't dominating, but the Aserai did very well. Now, I did run into one variation where the Aserai didn't do nearly as well. In fact, they nearly lost, so I just wanted to include that in here and just mention again that there's some variation to these tests. All right, so a little bit of a longer run up to the charge, and this one here, I haven't shortened it as much because I want to talk about changes to Sturgia. First, you may notice they look a little different. Of course, their cavalry have these new shields that make the sound of rain on a roof. There's also these guys. What the hell are they? There's cavalry with throwing axes. Well, these are the Variag veterans. They're no longer on foot. They are throwing axes from a horse, and I gotta be honest, I hate this change. I try to be gentle with Tailworlds, but they're listening, right? Hopefully they make some changes. If they wanted to listen to me, they would make a new weapon called the Throwing Hammer, where they unleashed it and it knocked units to the ground. I think that would be interesting. Maybe one of them and they whipped out their spear. Throwing hammers would actually be interesting. Throwing axes, not so good. I ran many tests because I was curious if there was any reason for this at all, or at least any benefit for this at all. Again, I'm trying to be gentle here as a tester, and they got absolutely worked every single battle. You can see here we had 150 of each of the Drudziniks and the Variag veterans, and every single battle, the Variag veterans were a liability. I presume they would be much better off on foot. Now, I wanted to test the Drudziniks, so we tested them separately, Tier 5 against Tier 5 against the archers, and they worked it, right? I figured that was going to be the case because they have powerful spears, and spear cavalry generally aim much better. That is the change that Tailworlds made. They seem to knock units down even more as well, but the Drudziniks came up very, very well. In fact, near the top. So on their own, I would say the Drudziniks are really improved. All right, so we're a full-service Bannerlord channel, of course, these days, and we did cover the Brigand, the Sturgian Brigand, which is their Tier 4 unit throwing javelins, and Drudziniks, which we just covered. Of course, the Drudziniks are strong. Combined, they did really well, but there was odd behavior. These guys literally stood there. Even when I told them to charge, they continued to stand there. So we had some non-participation in this example. There was actually a couple examples where they did this both times. They just stood there and would not do anything, but ultimately they did quite well. This combination is still successful. Now, the Battanian horsemen, you know, almost everybody's been waiting to laugh at the Battanian horsemen, and yes, they're still laughable. We did hear the Battanian scout and their Tier 5 Jav Cav, and they got obliterated. That's the only way to say it. They did very poorly. The scout is probably the worst Tier 4 unit in the game. They have virtually no value. And no matter what I tried here, I even tried a couple times where I micromanaged the javelin cavalry. We got mangled every single time. They're not the worst cavalry. You know who is? This is going to shock a lot of people. Now, keep in mind, it's archer versus cavalry. It's the Imperials because they don't have shields. A lot of the Imperial horsemen, of course, come riding in with, what is it, a courser lance or something like that? It's a two-handed lance, and of course, if archers are shooting at you, your guys get obliterated, and that is exactly what happened. So I won't say they're the worst overall, but they definitely did the worst versus archers. All right, let's do some experimenting here. Let's try some different tactics, some advanced formations. And I thought, hey, the wave of cavalry charging is so powerful. What happens if you follow it up with a second wave, right? So we broke our calves into two divisions. I figured the archers looking the other way, they get ramrodded again behind from the second cavalry, and it did great, but you guys can see the problem. Just like having two trains on the same track, just like my main character here, we got obliterated as all our cavalry sort of ran into each other, and it actually produced a net negative result compared to just charging. What about three waves, right? I tried all kinds of different things, and this is part of the beauty of Bannerlord, is that there's thousands, if not tens of thousands of different things for us to try. We all get to be mad scientists. This, again, was very successful initially. They actually had a little little bit of success cycle charging, but ultimately both of those examples were slightly less effective than simply charging in one big group. That is because you lose cohesiveness and the cavalry start to run into each other. Best to stick around with just charge formation. Now this was the most devastating tactic I did in all of my different examples. We tried it with the Imperials. It was a lot less successful, of course, because they have no shields. With the Valandians, it was devastating. Now it's also utterly impractical, and that was just a huge skein stretching 300 meters across the valley. The reason this is effective, as you'll see here, is that they cut through every single archer has 2 or 3 cavalrymen all spearing him, and there's almost no point or very few points where the archers don't have a giant horse in their face. Out of all the different things I tried and I'd practiced and fiddled around with stuff over the course of about 3 hours, this was the most consistently successful tactic. That said, you can never really do that, right? So it has limited practical application. Maybe in certain instances it might be effective. You might be effective just having a division in Skane follow you. Those tests are still to come. Now don't do it with the Imperials. In fact, don't charge archers with Imperials like you used to. Archers are so accurate now in Bannerlord, your Imperials, as you can see here, get melted. Even in a good formation like this, we still got blasted by the Imperial by archers. Now let's do some alternative things here. Let's do some defense, right? We've got pikes. This should work. We've got sharpshooters blasting them in pikes. The enemy's going to be destroyed, right? Pikes, they're doing their job, except they aim at the shields. They aim at the rider, aim at the horse. Right, if Tail Worlds was listening, have these guys programmed to aim lower. That way 90% of those horses are stood up. If they're stood up, they lose their momentum. Suddenly they're very weak. A lot of those horses might even die. That would be a great effect if Tail Worlds is listening, and they've proven that they're listening. Have the horses die and have the riders get shot off into the archers where they get mauled. That's what would happen historically, and I think it would look amazing for Bannerlord battles if all those riders got blasted off their horse went flying into the archers. Maybe even the horse knocks archers around, right? It would be a really interesting effect. Now, some guys recognize this right away. We had to test hammer and anvil, right? This is one of the most classic tactics from ancient times. Infantry in the front charging the enemy infantry, and we have nearly a perfect example here of hammer and anvil as our huge, massive cavalry slams into the back of the enemy, smashing them between the hammer and the anvil, and it just doesn't work very well, partly because the momentum system in Bannerlord doesn't really favor it. It doesn't really cause the pinch you want. The enemy is surrounded, so it has a little benefit, but it's very, very minor. You're actually better off doing a lot different things with your cavalry. When I tried this 3 or 4 different times, there wasn't a single example where it produced like an incredible result, although almost every time I did this, it had a positive result. So I would say ultimately hammer and anvil, a B-, maybe a C+. Has some value in Bannerlord, but ultimately not that effective. That's something that Tail Worlds could also change, and I have a couple suggestions in mind. The basic one would be just to make sure that guys, when they're charged from behind, take a lot more damage, right? If an infantryman is facing the other way and cavalrymen spear him, it should insta-kill the guy, or something to that effect. Again, I presume Tail Worlds is listening. They're probably not. All right, now I had to show you this because we've been showing you this whole time that cavalry is very, very powerful. However, and we've shown that pike and shot doesn't really work. How do you stop enemy cavalry besides a lot of your own cavalry? Archers don't work. This is the solution. Now, fortunately, guys on the channel have been using this for a long time. This shield and shock is what I call this, is incredibly powerful, especially paired with a bunch of crossbow. We've already seen that crossbow will kill cavalry, but not if they're charging through their ranks. So we're going to have 2 different cav lines on both sides here, the 2nd and 7th Division. If it looks like a lot of movement, trust me, we're not actually going to move our units that much. This is the kind of formation you can literally pause and copy, put it into your own game. In fact, we'll give you a little RTS overhead view here in a second. But this is the formation that will stop and destroy cavalry forces. The main reason is because cavalry in a shield wall like this do a really good job of slowing enemy cavalry down, and these savage warriors behind us here do a really good job of killing stood up horses. It's symbiosis. All right, let's go ahead and show you this this top-down view. I don't have the RTS mod, but we do have the photo mod here, so we can just back off. You can see our cav wings. both at slight angles because the enemy cavalry tends to come in on the angles. And then right behind them is shock troops, also told to hold fire. You do not want those guys throwing those little pitiful hatchets. You want them swinging those vultures. 30 feet, 10 meters behind them, lines of crossbow. And then, of course, out in front is a square. The reason you want the square out in front is because in this kind of a situation, a lot of the attention will be gathered by that square, which is absolutely indestructible to a cavalry charge, right? If you have good infantry in a square, at least 50, 60 men deep, they will stop a cavalry charge you know what I mean? It'll stop it right where it is. Now, the cavalry charge is huge, right? So you can't just use a square, hence the wings here. And we also want to give it those shock troops because that's how you're going to do a lot of your killing here. So the enemy's coming in, and you will see these shock troops just go ballistic here. The crossbow is adding damage. So it's 3 defensive divisions and 3 attacking divisions. It's a little bit like a sporting event, right? We have guys playing defense, trying to stop the enemy from scoring goals, and then we have guys scoring goals for our own side. Now, this is a battle you would probably lose if you F1 to F3. We're actually outnumbered here, but not with our Volgiers going crazy. You could see these guys bobbing up and down with those savage Volges, and part of the reason they hit the cavalry here is the enemy cavalry has stood up. They're trying to attack our square. They're trying to attack our cavalry out in front there. Some of them are sneaking through. The enemy is getting some kills here. In fact, this is a lot better than it would have been before the patch. Again, kudos the Tailworlds coders that have made these changes to cavalry. However, this is still the solution to killing cavalry. And I think this is also still the solution to having fun and dominating a Bannerlord. That is thoughtful tactics. Right? If something doesn't work, if you're one of those guys that's still doing hammer and anvil and you're getting modest results, or maybe you love pike and shot, you're a fan of the Spanish tercios and it's not working very well, adapt your tactics to things that work. Now, put in a little plug for our channel here. That is what we do. Our channel is all about tactics and Bannerlord. I'm a student of warfare. I'm a student of Bannerlord. I have an obscene amount of hours playing this game, and that's how you get results like this, where all of these heavy cavalry that you've just watched menace the battlefield for the last 45 minutes, well, I guess this episode's going to be cut down, they get blown from the battlefield here, and our side is victorious. All right, there's much more to cover with 1.32. There are changes to infantry. There are changes to the equipment that the infantry is using. We are going to cover that. We are going to cover some of the other broad changes with 1.32. We're going to try to give you tactics that apply to that, to the new two-handed maces that are now common in a lot of the shock troops. And just like this guy, you will be resolute throughout your battles. Now's your time to subscribe. Please hit that like button on the way out, friends, and I will see you next time.